Chapter 1. The Golden Feather. It was my last day at school. Mrs. Green, my science teacher, called me into her office.
"Come and look at this,"
she said, pointing to her computer.
Save the Wildlife, STW, Student for Expedition, 1st August to 3rd September. A group of scientists is looking for a student to help them on an expedition to the island of Comora in the Western Pacific. Please email Professor Yang Mei at yangm@sww.uk.co.
I met Professor Yang Mei many years ago in China,
said Mrs. Green.
"You're going to university in the autumn, Jemma. I know you want to make films about wildlife one day. If you're interested in this expedition, I'll write to her about you."
Comora, I thought. I've heard that name before. But where? Then I remembered. When I was young, my grandfather told me about Comora. I had something from Comora too. Something special. Mrs. Green sent an email to Professor Yang Mei, and 3 days later, I had a call from STW. They asked me to go to their London office the next day. When I arrived, a woman showed me into a room. A man and a woman were sitting behind a table. The man was about 40 and well-dressed with short, dark hair. The woman was older than the man. She had a clever face with quick, bright eyes.
"Jemma Parsons,"
said the woman.
"Please sit down. I'm Professor Yang Mei from Shanghai University."
She turned to the man.
"This is Dr. Mark Malone from the University of California."
I was very interested to meet Dr. Malone. He was a famous scientist and an expert on birds.
"Well, Jemma,"
said Professor Yang, smiling.
"Mrs. Green's told us some good things about you."
"Yes,"
said Dr. Malone. He was smiling too, but his smile was not very warm.
"But we want to ask you some questions. Why do you want to come on our expedition? You'll have to work hard, and we can't pay you."
"I'm not afraid of hard work," I said. "And money's not important for me. My dream is to make films about wildlife. There are many unusual animals and birds on islands like Comora. I want to make films so that people all over the world can learn about them."
"Yes, but a lot of other young people want to come with us,"
said Dr. Malone.
"Some of them have been on expeditions before. Why do you think you're better than they are?"
"Well," I said, "I've brought something special to show you." I took a large golden feather out of my bag. The professor and Dr. Malone looked at it in surprise.
"That's a very interesting feather,"
said Dr. Malone slowly.
"Where did you get it?"
"It's been in my family for many years," I said.
"Can I see it?"
he asked. I gave Dr. Malone the feather. He held it up and looked at it carefully. When the light shone on it, its colour was as bright as fire. Dr. Malone put the feather down on the table. His eyes were shining, and there was a strange look on his face.
Can you tell us a little more about it?
Asked Professor Yang. My grandfather was a sailor, I said. He sailed to some of the islands in the Western Pacific. One of these islands was Comora. One day, my grandfather helped the chief of a village there, and the chief gave him this feather. He brought it home for my grandmother. She put it on her hat. After my grandmother died, I found the hat inside an old box, and I remembered my grandfather's story about Comora. I looked carefully at the beautiful feather, and I understood that it came from a very special bird. So, I kept it in my cupboard and looked at it from time to time. Over the years, I began to have an important dream: to go to Comora one day and find that bird.
Well,
said Dr. Malone, looking again at the feather.
it's from a bird of paradise. They're some of the most beautiful and exciting birds in the world. There are many different kinds of them, of course, but I've never seen a feather like this before.
Thank you for showing it to us, Jemma,
said Professor Yang, as I put the feather back into my bag.
Now, do you want to ask us any questions?
Yes, I said. Why are you going on this expedition?
Our expedition's the first scientific expedition to Comora,
explained Professor Yang.
There may be interesting new species there. Each of us is an expert on a different kind of wildlife. I'm an expert on insects. Dr. Malone's our expert on birds. And we have an expert on snakes, too. Dr. Hamad Al-Bawani from Oman. Perhaps you know something about his work.
Yes, I said. Dr. Al-Bawani's done a lot of work on wildlife in the Middle East, and he's just written a new book.
That's right,
said Professor Yang, smiling.
You know a lot about the world of wildlife. I can see that. We also have a cameraman coming with us, a young man called Richard Cave.
It sounds very interesting, I said. I'd love to come with you.
Yes,
said Dr. Malone.
but we're going to talk to other young people, too.
The professor said she would call me the next day, but I was worried about Dr. Malone. I felt sure that he did not want me on the expedition. 2 days later, Professor Yang called me.
Hello, Jemma,
She said.
I've got good news for you. We'd like you to come to Comora with us.
That's great, I said. But what about Dr. Malone? Are you sure that he wants me on the expedition?
Oh, yes,
Said the professor.
he wants you to help him find new species of birds.
I could not sleep at all that night. I lay in bed and thought about the expedition. When I told my family and friends about the expedition, they were very excited too. Then, one evening, I had a call from Dr. Malone.
I'm very pleased that you're coming with us, Jemma.
He said,
There's just one thing. You know that feather of your grandmother's? Can I borrow it for a few days?
I'm sorry, Dr. Malone, I said, but I don't want to give the feather to anyone.
All right.
He said.
It doesn't matter, but don't forget to bring it with you, will you?
I was very busy for the next weeks, getting ready for the expedition. At last, it was time to leave. 1 month later, after a long journey, we arrived on Comorra by helicopter. Chapter 2. The Camp on Comorra. Comorra was an island in a group of islands with the same government. The largest island had towns and roads and an airport, but Comorra was smaller, with no roads at all. There were only rivers, hills, and lots of jungle. Our camp was near a river in the jungle. Each of us had a tent for sleeping, and there was a large kitchen for all of us. 2 men came to help with the cooking and washing. We had a lab too, where we studied the animals and birds we found. The jungle was not an easy or comfortable place. At night, it was so hot that it was difficult to sleep. I felt tired most of the time. Insects were a big problem too. Thousands of them came into the camp looking for food. My work was hard, but also interesting. There were so many new things to learn. I loved helping Professor Yang and working with Dr. Hamad Al-Bawani, the expert on snakes. I liked Richard Cave too, the expedition cameraman. He was about 25, with a friendly smile. Every day, we found birds, snakes, and insects. Some of these were new to science, and that was very exciting. We brought them back to the lab and studied them. We took photos and wrote a lot of information about them. Then we took these living things back into the jungle and released them. But sometimes there were problems between the different scientists. One afternoon, Professor Yang and I found a beetle under some leaves on the ground.
I've never seen a beetle like this before,
said the professor excitedly.
I think it's a new species.
The beetle was very unusual, with a large head and a golden purple body. We took it back to the camp and showed it to the others. It was getting dark, so the professor put the beetle in a box in the laboratory.
It'll be safe here in the lab tonight,
she said.
We'll study it in the morning.
The next morning, the professor was late for breakfast. When she arrived, she was looking very worried.
What's happened to the beetle I found yesterday?
She asked.
What do you mean?
Said Dr. Malone.
Isn't it in the lab?
No,
said the professor.
It's disappeared from its box. Look.
She held out the empty box.
I saw you in the lab this morning, Richard,
said Dr. Malone.
Do you know anything about the beetle?
Well,
said Richard slowly.
I took it out of the box.
What?
Said the professor in surprise.
Why did you do that?
I wanted to take some pictures of it,
said Richard.
But after I finished, I put it back in the box.
But the top of the box was open,
said the professor angrily.
So you forgot to close the box,
said Dr. Malone.
And the beetle ran away. Well, perhaps it's somewhere in the camp.
We looked everywhere for the beetle, but we could not find it. For the next few days, the professor was angry with Richard. One afternoon, I was in trouble too. I was resting in my tent when I heard Dr. Malone calling me from the laboratory.
Jemma, come here. I need your help.
I ran and found Dr. Malone. He was holding a little bird in his hand. I could see its head and the top of its wings. It was bright red, yellow, and blue.
I found this bird in the jungle this morning,
said Dr. Malone excitedly.
Can you hold it for me while I take a photo? Sit down here, on this chair.
I sat down and Dr. Malone put the little bird into my hand. Its feathers felt soft and warm. Suddenly, I looked down. I saw a large, hairy spider moving quickly across the ground towards my feet. I screamed and jumped up from my chair. I forgot I was holding the little bird. I opened my hands and it flew out of the lab and high up into the trees.
You stupid girl!
Cried Dr. Malone.
I'll never find that kind of bird again.
I'm sorry, I said in a small voice. That spider gave me a terrible shock.
If you don't like spiders, why did you come on this expedition?
Said Dr. Malone. He walked away angrily. I felt very unhappy and I needed to talk to somebody. So later, I told Richard about the bird. Dr. Malone will tell everyone what happened, I said. Nobody will want me to work with them.
Don't worry, Jemma,
said Richard kindly.
It was just an accident. No one will blame you.
But Dr. Malone blames me, I thought to myself. That night, in my tent, I could not sleep. I heard Dr. Malone's voice in my head.
You stupid girl. You stupid girl.
I put my hand under my camp bed, where I kept the bag with my grandmother's feather. Yes, the bag was still there. It was good to know that it was safe. But I'll never find my bird of paradise, I thought unhappily. It's just a stupid dream. Perhaps Dr. Malone was right. I don't belong on this expedition. It's better for everyone if I leave. It was very hot and I felt thirsty. I got up and went outside to get a drink of water. The trees were black against the night sky, but a bright moon shone down on the camp. I looked into the dark forest. Just then, I saw two eyes shining brightly in the trees. They looked like the eyes of a small animal. I moved nearer to the eyes, but they disappeared. I started walking deeper into the forest. Suddenly, I heard a voice behind me.
Jemma, don't move.
Chapter 3. Up the River. I stopped. A few minutes later, Richard Cave came out of the trees. He shone a light on the ground. Something long and thin was pushing through the grass towards me. It was a snake. It moved nearer and then rested at my feet.
I'll go and get help,
said Richard quietly. He went away and I waited. My mouth felt dry and my legs were shaking badly. At last, Richard came back with Dr. Hamad. Dr. Hamad was carrying a long stick with a fork at the end.
It's all right, Jemma,
said Dr. Hamad quietly.
Don't be afraid.
He touched the snake's back with the stick, and it turned round angrily. It moved quickly, but Dr. Hamad was quicker. He caught its head in the stick and closed his hand round its neck. I saw its small black eyes looking up at me.
This is a very dangerous kind of snake,
said Dr. Hamad.
You were lucky.
I saw you walking in the forest, Jemma,
said Richard.
I hope you've learned your lesson. The jungle is a dangerous place. Please don't go walking by yourself at night again.
The next morning, Professor Yang came and spoke to me.
I've heard about some people who live up the river,
she said.
They're called the Mahdi, and they know many things about the wildlife on the island. I've sent a message to their chief asking for his help. We'll go and visit them this afternoon. I'm going back to my tent now. I have to pay the men who come and help us. Can you tell the others that we're going upriver, please, Jemma? Tell them to be ready by 2 o'clock.
I quickly ran to my tent. I wanted to take the feather with me, so I took the bag out from under my bed. After that, I found Richard and Dr. Hamad and gave them Professor Yang's message. They were very pleased about our plans to visit the Mahdi people. Then I went to look for Dr. Malone. Dr. Malone was in his tent. He was sitting at a small table with his back to me. I stood in the doorway and called his name, but he did not hear me. So I went inside the tent. To my surprise, there was a large pile of US dollars in front of him. Dr. Malone, I began. Dr. Malone turned round quickly. His face was dark and angry.
What are you doing here?
He shouted.
And what are you looking at?
I'm sorry, I said. I called you, but you didn't hear me. The professor asked me to give you a message. This afternoon, we're going upriver to the village of the Mahdi people.
Oh,
said Dr. Malone.
Oh, I see. Well, I'm sorry I shouted at you, Jemma, but you gave me a shock.
He saw me looking at the pile of dollars on the table.
This money is for the men who come to help us,
he said.
Professor Yang asked me to pay them.
But the professor's just paid them herself, I said.
Really?
Said Dr. Malone.
Oh, I see.
He laughed.
Well, I don't need to pay them then.
But why has Dr. Malone brought all these dollars to the jungle? I thought. That afternoon, we travelled up the river in 2 small boats. Professor Yang and Dr. Malone were in one boat, and Richard, Dr. Hamad and I were in the other. The river was big and deep. On each side of the river, there were hills with forest. The trees of the forest came down to the bank. It was a beautiful day, and the water shone in the afternoon sun. Small insects danced on top of the water. I put my hand into the river. The water felt cold and wonderful.
Jemma!
Shouted Dr. Hamad.
Don't do that! Look over there!
I took my hand out quickly and looked. I saw something with a long body and tail disappearing into the water.
The water's full of crocodiles,
said Dr. Hamad.
They'll grab you if they can, then pull you down to the bottom of the river.
The day was hot, but suddenly I felt cold. The water still shone in the sunlight, but the river was not as beautiful to me as before. After some time, we came to a high waterfall. Here, the water poured down the hill into the river and made a whirlpool. The water in the whirlpool was white and turning round very fast. It looked very dangerous,
Don't take your boat near there.
shouted Dr. Malone. Richard made the engine of the boat go faster, and we drove quickly past the whirlpool. At last, we saw some huts on the riverbank in front of us,
That's the village of the muddy people, I think.
said Professor Yang. As I looked at the land near the village, I was very surprised. The ground was empty of forest, and there were large piles of logs standing by the river. That's strange, I thought. What's happened to all the trees? A tall young man was waiting for us on the riverbank.
Good afternoon.
He said, smiling.
My name is Ranu. Our chief is waiting for you. Please, follow me.
Thank you, Ranu.
Said Professor Yang. As we followed Rano through the village, the people came out of their huts and watched us. They wore clothes with bright colours, but they did not look very happy. A young woman with a baby stopped Ranu and spoke to him. She looked at us with eyes that were full of hope, but when he spoke to her, she looked sad,
Was she asking about us?
said Professor Yang.
Yes,
Said Ranu.
her baby is ill and needs to see a doctor. But I told her, you are all scientists.
We came to a large hut, and Ranu took us inside. A man was sitting on a carpet. He was no longer young, but he had a strong, clever face and quick, bright eyes,
This is Chief Bata.
said Ranu.
He doesn't speak English, but I can translate for you.
Chapter 4. Into the Jungle. The chief pointed to the ground and we sat down. A boy came in and gave each of us a drink. It tasted wonderful.
Please tell Chief Bata that we've come to study the wildlife in the forest.
Said Professor Yang.
We'd like to ask for his help.
Ranu translated and the chief replied in his language.
The chief is ready to help you.
Said Ranu.
But first, he has something important to tell you.
We're a village of only a few hundred people.
Said the chief.
Last year, something terrible happened here. Many people became ill from malaria, but we had no money to buy medicine, so a lot of babies and young children died.
So that's why the people in the village looked sad, I thought.
Then some men from a foreign company came.
Said the chief.
They asked us to sell them our land and trees. They said they would pay us a lot of money. We needed money for medicine. So I called a meeting of our most important people. We agreed to sell some of our land. Workmen came, cut down our trees, and made them into logs. Now they're taking the logs down the river to the sea.
Yes,
Said the professor.
we saw piles of logs by the river.
Last week, the men came back.
Said the chief.
Now they want us to sell more of our land. I don't know what to do. If the men cut down our trees, they'll destroy our forest. Then the animals and birds will lose their homes and die.
I understand.
said the professor.
You love your forest and you don't want to destroy it. But you also have to think about your people. You have to do your best for them too.
Yes.
Said the chief.
We need money for medicine, and we also need to build a school. You see, Ranu is the only person in our village who's been to school. We sent him away to study on another island. That's where he learned English. But we need a school here, in our village.
As I listened to Chief Batter's story, I began to feel very sad about the forest and the animals. I also felt worried about the people in the village and their life in the years to come.
You're scientists.
Said the chief.
Perhaps you can find out important things about our forest and help us to save it. We're ready to help you, but you must help us too.
We were silent, thinking about the chief's words. Then Dr. Malone said,
Show Chief Batter your feather, Jemma.
I took my grandmother's feather out of my bag. The chief and Ranu looked at it carefully.
Have you ever seen a feather like this before?
Asked Dr. Malone.
Yes,
Said Ranu.
it comes from a very unusual bird. But it doesn't live near our village any longer. You can only find it in one special place now. And that place is deep in the jungle.
Really?
Said Dr. Malone in an excited voice.
Can you take us there?
Ranu spoke to the chief for a few minutes.
Chief Batter says that tomorrow I can take you into the forest.
He said.
But tonight you must stay here with us.
Ranu took us to some huts so that we could rest. That evening, the villagers gave us a wonderful meal with fish and many kinds of vegetables and fruit. After the meal, a group of young men danced for us. On their heads, they wore feathers with wonderful colours. I sat beside Richard, watching the dancers. Where did they get those beautiful feathers? I asked him.
From birds of paradise.
Said Richard.
Ranu told me that many years ago, the Māori people hunted the birds. They don't hunt them now, but they've kept the feathers for their dances.
I was feeling tired, so I said goodnight to Richard and went back to my hut. On the way, I saw Dr. Malone and Ranu standing under a tree. Dr. Malone had his hand on Ranu's arm and was talking to him very fast. That's strange, I thought. What are they talking about? Early next morning, I dressed quickly and put my grandmother's feather inside my rucksack. Then I went outside. The others were standing under the trees. They had their rucksacks on their backs, and Richard was carrying his camera. We followed Ranu into the jungle. It was a dark, strange world. The trees were so tall that you could not see the sun. But Ranu was an expert at finding his way. He moved quickly through the trees. The jungle all looks the same, I said to Richard.
Yes,
He replied.
sometimes people get lost in the jungle for days. They can't remember their way, and if nobody finds them, they die.
After 3 hours, I was hot and tired from carrying my heavy rucksack. Then we came to a stream. We all stood looking down at the water. It was moving very fast,
I don't see a bridge.
said Dr. Malone.
How can we get across this stream?
Don't worry,
Said Ranu.
The water's not very deep. We can walk across.
Ranu climbed down into the stream. At once, the water came halfway up his body. But he walked across easily, pushing against the strong current. Soon he reached the other side.
It's all right.
He shouted.
Don't be afraid.
Next, Richard walked across, holding his camera high above his head. Professor Yang climbed down into the stream and started to walk across. But then something terrible happened. She slipped and fell, and her head disappeared under the water. Chapter 5. A Wonderful Bird. I jumped into the stream. At once, I felt the strong current around my legs pulling me down. But I pushed against it and quickly reached the professor. I grabbed her and held her head out of the water. Then I moved her towards the side of the stream. Dr. Hamad reached down and pulled the professor out. He laid her on the ground in the warm sun. Her face was white and her eyes were closed. Dr. Hamad looked at her carefully.
She's all right,
He said.
but she has had a bad shock.
Richard and Ranu came back across the stream. We stood around the professor, looking at her with worried faces. After a few minutes, the professor opened her eyes. She tried to stand, but her legs were shaking.
I'm so sorry.
She said.
I don't feel very well. I don't think I can go on.
Don't worry, Professor.
Said Dr. Hamad.
You'll be all right. We'll take you back to the village.
He turned to Ranu.
Ranu, please go and bring help.
After Ranu left, we moved the professor out of the sun under a tree. I brought water from the stream for her to drink. At last, Ranu came back with 4 young men. They were carrying a bed which was made of rope. They laid the bed on the grass and helped the professor onto it.
One of us must go back to the village with the professor,
Said Richard.
She needs someone to stay with her.
I'll go, I said at once.
No, Jemma.
Said Dr. Hamad.
You came here to find your bird. I'll go back with the professor. We'll wait for you at the village.
The men left, carrying the bed, and Dr. Hamad walked beside them. Soon, they disappeared into the forest.
Take us to the bird, Ranu.
Said Dr. Malone. The 3 of us followed Ranu through the jungle. Sometimes he had to cut his way through the trees with a knife. I was afraid that snakes and spiders were hiding under the leaves. The forest was noisy with the sound of birds, and sometimes we saw their bright colours in the trees. At last, we reached an open place with trees all around.
Shh!
Said Ranu.
Don't make a noise. Look over there.
I suddenly saw a very beautiful and unusual bird sitting on a branch. It was blue and red, with tall green feathers on its head. The feathers in its tail were longer than its body. They were the colour of bright fire, just like my wonderful feather. That's it, I said excitedly. That's my bird of paradise. Ranu moved silently towards the bird, and we followed him. The bird watched us with bright eyes, but it didn't move. Why doesn't it fly away? I asked. Isn't it afraid of us?
Perhaps it's never seen people before,
replied Richard.
It doesn't know that people can hurt it.
Just then, the bird made a strange noise. It jumped up to another branch and shook the feathers in its tail. Then it jumped again, turning this way and that way. It was dancing a strange and wonderful dance. Is it dancing for us? I asked.
No,
said Dr. Malone.
there's a female bird somewhere. The bird is dancing for her. Look, there she is.
I saw a small brown bird sitting on a branch, but I was not surprised. I knew that male and female birds of paradise look very different. Only the male birds have wonderful bright feathers. Dr. Malone opened his rucksack and took out a net and a large sack. He gave the net to Ranu.
Get ready to catch that bird, Ranu,
He said quietly.
I want to take it back to the lab.
The bird went on dancing for a long time. Richard took his camera and quietly began filming it. But suddenly, the female bird flew away. The male bird stopped dancing and sat on the branch, looking after her.
Quick!
Cried Dr. Malone.
Now!
Ranu jumped on the bird like a large cat and threw the net over it. Dr. Malone opened the sack and Ranu dropped the bird into it. Then he tied the sack at the top. The bird moved its wings and made a noise, but after a few minutes it was silent. Please, don't hurt it, I cried.
Don't worry, Jemma.
Said Dr. Malone.
Of course we're not going to hurt this wonderful bird. But we're scientists, and our job is to study it. We can only do that in the lab.
We went back through the forest and across the stream. At last we reached the village. Dr. Hamad told us that Professor Yang was asleep in one of the huts. So we got into a boat and went down the river to our camp. Ranu came with us, carrying the sack. Dr. Hamad stayed in the village with the professor. Dr. Malone went at once to the laboratory. He took the bird out of the sack and dropped it into a cage. The bird shook its bright feathers and sat in the cage, watching us. It still did not seem afraid. That evening, as I was getting ready for bed in my tent, I heard voices. I looked outside. By the light of the moon, I saw Dr. Malone and Ranu. They were talking together outside Dr. Malone's tent, but I could not hear what they were saying. Why is Dr. Malone always talking to Ranu? I thought. Next morning, I worked with Dr. Malone in the laboratory. We took photos of the bird and wrote information about its body, head, wings and tail. I admired the quick way that Dr. Malone worked. He really was an expert scientist. By lunchtime, everything was finished.
Well done, Jemma,
said Dr. Malone.
You did a great job.
Thank you, I said, smiling. Are you going to take the bird back to the forest now?
Yes,
replied Dr. Malone.
Ranu will come with me. We'll release it in the same place that we found it.
I felt sad that I would not see the wonderful bird again. But I was also happy that we were taking it back to its home in the forest. The forest was where it belonged. Can I come with you? I asked Dr. Malone.
Of course,
said Dr. Malone.
I'll come and get you when we're ready to leave.
I went to my tent for a rest, but I was tired from my morning's work, and soon I was asleep. When I woke up, it was late afternoon. Oh no, I thought. Why didn't Dr. Malone call me? I ran to the laboratory, but nobody was there. The bird's cage stood empty and silent. Chapter 6: Secrets and Lies. I stood, looking sadly at the empty cage.
What's the matter, Jemma?
Said a voice behind me. I turned and saw Richard. I wanted to take the bird back to the forest with Dr. Malone and Ranu, I said, but they've gone without me.
Are you sure?
Said Richard.
Perhaps Dr. Malone's still in his tent. Let's go and see.
We went to Dr. Malone's tent and called his name, but nobody replied. So we pushed back the doorway and went inside. There was a sweet, heavy smell in the tent. What's that strange smell? I asked. Richard picked up a small, empty bottle lying on a table and held it to his nose. He said.
It smells like chloroform.
Chloroform? I said in surprise. Suddenly, I saw a small golden feather on the ground. I picked it up and held it in my hand. You don't think that Dr. Malone gave the bird chloroform, do you? I asked.
I don't know.
Said Richard in a worried voice.
But let's have a look around.
I looked around the tent and saw Dr. Malone's rucksack under the bed. I pulled it out and opened it. There was a small box inside. I opened the box and saw a large purple and gold beetle. I gave a sudden cry and closed the box quickly.
That's Professor Yang's beetle,
said Richard.
Malone blamed me for losing it, and the professor was angry with me. But he took the beetle himself. We have to find out what's going on. Let's go to the village. Perhaps we can find Malone there.
We ran to the river, but only one boat was there.
So Malone and Ranu have gone up the river,
said Richard.
Come on, let's follow them.
We jumped into the boat and Richard started the engine. He drove as fast as he could up the river. When we reached the village, we saw Dr. Malone's boat on the riverbank. We pulled our boat up the riverbank too. Then we ran to the huts. At the first hut we came to, we heard two voices speaking in English. One voice was loud and angry, but the other voice was quiet and cold. It's Dr. Malone and Ranu, I said.
Shh,
said Richard.
Don't talk. They'll hear you.
Where's my money?
Shouted Ranu.
You promised to pay me today. I can't wait any longer.
Look,
said Dr. Malone.
I've told you I can't take it with me while the others are still here. You'll have to hide it until they leave. I'll tell them I'm staying on the island to do more work. Then I'll come and get it, and I'll pay you the money. I've got it all ready in dollars, as we agreed.
All right,
said Ranu.
but if you don't pay me, I'll kill it.
I looked up at Richard and said quietly, Are they talking about the bird?
Yes,
he replied.
Come on, there's no time to lose.
We ran around the hut and in through the doorway. Dr. Malone and Ranu turned to us in surprise.
What's going on?
Asked Richard, looking around the hut.
Where's the bird?
It isn't here.
Said Dr. Malone, smiling coldly.
Ranu took it back to the forest.
That's a lie, I said. Ranu hasn't had time to do that. It's still here in this hut, isn't it?
I don't know what you're talking about,
said Dr. Malone. There was a pile of old leaves in the corner. I started to feel under the leaves. I pulled out a brown sack from the bottom of the pile. There was something big and heavy inside it. "What's in here?" I asked. Then I started to open the sack.
Give that to me,
shouted Dr. Malone. He tried to grab the sack, but I pushed him away. I put my hand inside and pulled out the beautiful bird of paradise. Its eyes were closed, and the long feathers in its tail hung down. It felt cold and heavy in my hands. "What have you done to it?" I cried. "Have you killed it?"
You stupid girl,
said Dr. Malone.
The bird isn't dead. I gave it a little chloroform to keep it quiet.
But why did you give it chloroform?
Asked Richard.
You were taking it back to the forest.
Suddenly, I understood. But he wasn't taking it back to the forest, I said slowly. He was stealing it, and Ranu was helping him. I looked at Ranu. He was standing in a corner of the hut, silent and afraid. "That's right, isn't it? Come on, Ranu. No more lies. Tell us what's going on. If you don't, I'll take you to Chief Batter,"
No,
said Ranu.
no, please, don't do that.
He pointed to Dr. Malone.
I had to help him. There was no other way. He told me to say I took the bird back to the forest. He told me to keep it here, secretly, in this hut.
A shadow fell across the doorway of the hut. I turned and saw Professor Yang. Dr. Hamad was standing behind her.
I heard voices,
she said. She looked at each of us, then at the bird in my hand.
Will somebody please tell me what's going on?
I'm sorry, Professor,
said Richard.
but Dr. Malone is a thief. He was stealing the bird of paradise.
And he took your beetle too, I said. The professor looked at Dr. Malone.
Is this true, Mark?
She asked quietly. Dr. Malone did not reply. Suddenly, he pulled out a knife. Before I could stop him, he grabbed me. With one hand, he held my arms behind my back. With the other, he held the knife against my neck. Chapter 7. The Chase on the River. The knife felt hard and cold against my neck. It was a terrible shock, and I dropped the bird. It lay on the ground at my feet. At once, Richard moved nearer to me.
Stay where you are,
said Dr. Malone.
or I'll kill her.
Don't be a fool,
said the professor.
Put the knife down.
Give me the bird first,
said Dr. Malone.
This girl is nothing to me. You decide, Professor. Which is more important, the girl or the bird? I'll give you 10 seconds. 1, 2, 3.
Stop.
Said Professor Yang.
All right, Mark. You win. Give him the bird, Richard.
Richard picked up the bird. He put it into the sack and gave it to Dr. Malone. At once, Dr. Malone grabbed it. He pushed me away, and I fell heavily to the ground.
Good,
said Dr. Malone.
I'm leaving now. Don't try to follow me.
He pushed past us and disappeared through the doorway of the hut.
Are you all right, Jemma?
Asked Richard. My arm hurt, but there was no time to think about that. Yes, I said. I'm fine,
Come on!
cried Dr. Hamad.
Malone mustn't get away.
But what about the professor? I said.
Don't worry about me.
Said the professor.
Go after Malone. I'll take Ranu to Chief Butter.
Richard, Dr. Hamad and I ran out of the hut and down to the river. There were black clouds in the sky, and it was beginning to rain. It was difficult to run quickly on the wet ground. Twice I slipped and nearly fell. At last, we reached the riverbank. Dr. Malone was there beside the boats. Suddenly, he turned round. When he saw us, he took out his knife and held it up.
I told you not to follow me.
He shouted.
Don't come any nearer.
We all stopped. Dr. Malone threw the sack with the bird into one of the boats. Then he pushed the other boat far out into the river. At once, the current began to carry it away. Then Dr. Malone jumped into the boat with the sack and started the engine. He drove away quickly without looking back.
He's going back to the camp,
said Richard. We stood watching our boat in the river. We were all thinking the same thing. How could we chase after Dr. Malone now?
Look!
Said Dr. Hamad. Suddenly, through the rain, we saw another boat out on the river. It looked like a small fishing boat. Our boat was moving towards it. There were 2 men in the fishing boat. One of them caught our boat. He tied it to the fishing boat with a rope. Then the men pulled our boat back to the riverbank. We ran to meet the fishing boat. There were piles of fish in it. The 2 men jumped out, smiling. They cut the rope and pushed our boat towards us. We thanked the men, but there was no time to lose. We jumped into our boat, and Richard started the engine. By now, it was raining very hard. We drove down the river, but we could not see Dr. Malone's boat.
I think we've lost him.
Cried Dr. Hamad above the noise of the engine. We came to a large bend in the river. As we drove around the bend, we saw something surprising. Dr. Malone's boat was in the river in front of us, but it was not moving anymore. It was at the place where the waterfall poured into the river and made a whirlpool. The boat was in the whirlpool, turning round and round in the dangerous white water.
Look!
Said Dr. Hamad.
Malone's in trouble.
Dr. Malone was standing up in his boat, looking at the engine. He was trying to start it, but no sound came out. He tried again and again, but it was no good.
My engine's broken.
He shouted.
My boat's going to sink.
All right,
Shouted Richard.
we'll help you.
Richard drove our boat slowly towards the whirlpool. But soon we began to feel the whirlpool pulling us. Richard stopped the engine.
I can't bring the boat any nearer.
He shouted.
It's too dangerous.
Hurry up!
Shouted Dr. Malone.
I'm sinking!
There was a rope in the bottom of our boat. Dr. Hamad took it and threw it to Dr. Malone. It was difficult to throw the rope in the rain. He threw it again and again, but the rope was too short, and it didn't reach Dr. Malone's boat.
It's no good.
Shouted Richard.
Jump into the water and swim to us.
Dr. Malone looked around, but his boat was sinking in the whirlpool. He grabbed the sack and jumped into the river. away from the whirlpool. His head disappeared under the water, but a few seconds later, we saw it again. He was a strong swimmer, but the current was stronger. It started to pull him away. Richard drove our boat after Dr. Malone. But suddenly, Dr. Hamad pointed to the riverbank.
Crocodiles!
He shouted. I saw 3 long crocodiles slip into the water. Dr. Malone saw them too. He cried out and tried to swim to our boat, but he could not swim fast because he was still holding the sack with the bird.
Drop the sack!
Shouted Richard.
Now! Before it's too late!
I can't!
Shouted Dr. Malone.
I'll lose the bird!
Don't be a fool!
Cried Richard.
Forget the bird! Do you want to die?
Dr. Malone still had the sack in his hand, but he could not hold it any longer. In the end, he dropped it, and it sank down into the water. Then Dr. Hamad threw the rope again, and this time Dr. Malone grabbed it. He hung onto it with both hands. We started pulling him towards our boat, but it was very difficult. His body turned this way and that way in the river, and sometimes his head disappeared under the water, but he still held on to the rope. I could not see the crocodiles, but I knew they were somewhere deep in the river. At last, we pulled Dr. Malone to the boat. We grabbed him and tried to help him over the side, but his clothes were wet and heavy, and it was difficult to hold him. He started to sink down into the water.
Hurry!
Cried Richard.
The whirlpool's pulling us towards it.
Suddenly, Dr. Malone screamed in pain. Chapter 8. Dr. Malone's Story. I saw a crocodile's head in the water. Its teeth were around Dr. Malone's leg. It started pulling him back into the river. Dr. Malone screamed again.
Ah! My leg!
We began hitting the crocodile on the nose, but the crocodile still held on to Dr. Malone's leg.
My knife!
Screamed Dr. Malone.
Get my knife! It's in my shirt pocket.
I reached over and grabbed the knife from Dr. Malone's pocket. My arm still hurt, but I took the knife and pushed it deep into the crocodile's nose. The crocodile opened its mouth in surprise and pain. It fell back into the water. At once, Dr. Hamad and I pulled Dr. Malone into the boat. Blood poured from his leg and ran onto the floor of the boat. Richard took off his shirt and gave it to me. I tied it around Dr. Malone's leg to stop the blood. Then we drove back to the village as fast as we could. Dr. Malone's face was white and his body was shaking. He sat in the boat without saying anything. It was good that he was safe, but I also felt very angry with him. Dr. Malone is alive, I thought. We saved him from a terrible death. But the bird of paradise is lost. It's at the bottom of the river, and it's all because of him. Professor Yang was waiting for us back at the village. When we told her what happened, She looked very unhappy.
How could this happen?
She said,
We came here to save wildlife, not to destroy it.
Later, we took Dr. Malone back to the camp. I put a strong bandage on his leg and gave him some medicine. He was still in pain, but after a time, the colour started to come back into his face. Professor Yang called a helicopter to come and take Dr. Malone to the hospital on another island. As we sat, waiting for it to arrive, she said,
Please explain something, Mark. You're a top scientist and a very clever man. Important people all over the world admire your work. It was a terrible crime to steal that bird. Why did you do it?
All right.
said Dr. Malone.
I'll tell you if you really want to know. It all started several years ago.
He said,
I got a new job with the University of California, so I moved there with my wife. Rich people were living all around us, and I soon began to want a rich man's life too. I bought a big house and a fast car, and expensive clothes for my wife. Every year we went on wonderful holidays. But I didn't have the money for these things. I started to borrow money from the bank, but I couldn't pay it back. One day, I met a man at a party. I told him I was an expert on birds. He was very interested and told me he was a collector of unusual wildlife. He asked me to bring him a rare bird from the jungle in Mexico. He said he would pay me $50,000. At first, I said no. But then, one morning I had a call from the bank. They said that they would take away my house and my car. So, I went to Mexico and found the bird that the man wanted. I hid it in a special bag under my coat and smuggled it into the U.S. The man paid me $50,000. It was very easy money. A few months later, the man came to see me again. This time, he wanted a rare bird from a country in West Africa. I went there and got the bird and smuggled it into the U.S. Again, he paid me well. After that, I brought him many different birds. Sometimes his friends wanted birds as presents for their children's birthdays, so I brought birds for them too. Sometimes I smuggled small animals and rare insects.
Yes, I said. We found Professor Yang's beetle in your tent,
So you smuggle wildlife?
said Dr. Hamad.
You take animals and birds away from their homes in the forest and sell them for money?
Many of these birds and animals are very rare, I said, and you're destroying them. Doesn't that worry you at all?
Yes, of course.
Said Dr. Malone.
But a collector will pay a lot of money for a rare bird, you know.
We were silent. We were all very shocked by Dr. Malone's words.
The helicopter will be here soon.
Said Professor Yang.
You will leave your computer here, and you will not return to our expedition. Tomorrow, I'll call the University of California and tell them what has happened. Do you have anything more to say?
Not really.
Said Dr. Malone.
Only that I am sorry about the bird of paradise.
That evening, I didn't sleep well. In the end, I got up and went outside my tent. Everything was very quiet. There was a beautiful moon and hundreds of shining stars. I sat and thought about Dr. Malone. How could his life have gone so wrong? But most of all, I thought about the bird of paradise. I remembered its wonderful feathers and its dance in the forest. Now, it could never dance again.
Can't you sleep, Jemma?
Said a voice. I turned and saw Professor Yang standing behind me. Why couldn't I do more to save the bird of paradise? I said sadly. Why couldn't I stop Dr. Malone? The professor sat down beside me.
Don't feel bad, Jemma.
She said kindly.
You couldn't save that bird. None of us could save it. But we can still do something. We can do our best to stop people smuggling wildlife for money and selling birds and animals to rich collectors.
I thought for a second and then said, "You're right, Professor. Thank you." A few days later, we left Comora. I looked out of the window of our helicopter. Its shadow moved over the trees like a strange kind of bird. I saw the island below us. I saw the blue sea and the green jungle and the shining rivers. We found some new species on Comora, I thought, but we didn't learn everything about the island. It still has some secrets. One day, I'll come back and find them. It's October, and I've just started university. I'm in a different world now. The summer days have ended, and the trees in the park are losing their leaves. Comora is like a dream. The golden sunshine and blue seas are very far away. Professor Yang is writing a report about the new species of wildlife we found. She's going to send it to the government of the island group which Comora belongs to. The report says that the forests and the wildlife are important to science. The professor is going to ask the government to give the people of the islands more money so they won't have to sell their land. Professor Yang and Dr. Hamad are very pleased with their work on the island. They found snakes and insects new to science. Richard is happy too. He made some wonderful films about the wildlife on Comora, and now a television company wants to buy them. A few days ago, I read a story in the newspaper.
Top scientist arrested. Dr. Mark Malone, world expert on birds from the University of California, was arrested yesterday at his home for the crime of smuggling rare birds into the United States.
I still have my grandmother's feather. I've made a promise to myself and the lost bird. Well, 2 promises. The first is that one day I'll go back to Comora. The second is that I'll do everything I can to save the wildlife on Comora and in other places too. I learned many things from the expedition. I learned about the work of scientists, and I learned about new kinds of wildlife. I also learned about the dark side of life, and that sometimes people can lose their way. I'll never forget the bird of paradise. It's given me hope. You think you can do nothing, but you can always do something. One day,